Well, my research on ADHD, but also on autism and other developmental disorders, was really focused on trying to find what happens in the brain that leads to development going awry, leading to symptoms of such disorders. One of the big problems we had and still have in psychiatry is that the biology doesn't map very well onto the symptoms. So my whole line of research was about trying to define and find more biological subtypes where we could have brain systems or cognitive symptoms that mapped onto the biology much better, trying to get at what is the cascade from biology to symptoms, which is, of course, a very materialist reductionist approach. And it was a pretty successful line of research. Did that for a good many years, 20 years at least. And we did find what we called subtypes that were related to different types of cognitive profiles that kids had that then related better to the biology than just the symptoms profiles did, or we thought they would, but it turns out they didn't actually explain anything better. So I got to the point that I realized, well, here we have what ought to be these biological subtypes that map onto the biology much better, where we're getting at the cascade from biology to symptoms, and they weren't mapping any better than the basically arbitrary categories in the DSM, so the labels that we use, ADHD or autism or whatever. And that really got me thinking about, well, why is this the case? Why aren't we should be getting closer to the biology? Why are we not explaining more of the variants than we were before? Which is how I ended up thinking about consciousness again, when I realized, well, what happens in these disorders? ADHD is not a list of symptoms that children have. Children don't say things like, I have hyperactive behavior. They, say, well, I have a hard time sitting still in class because, I feel the urge to move. And ADHD for them is something that's very much in their consciousness, in their human experience of who they are. And that got me interested in consciousness again, which led me to start reading about and investigating the field of consciousness research, which wasn't there when I was a student doing psychology, but which has developed in the last 25 years. And I realized that they're much further along than we were at that point, certainly in psychiatry, and saying, we really don't understand these cascades. We're looking for what happens in the brain to cause consciousness. We're looking for the neural correlates of consciousness, as that's called, but we can't find them. We just really don't know what the mechanism is. And the interesting thing about that field at the time compared to psychiatry was that it had philosophers of mind working in it, in addition to neuroscientists, whereas psychiatry was very much focused on neuroscientists. And, they were sort of throwing out ideas like, well, we're taking a particular approach here, materialist reductionism, but that might not be the right framework to be thinking about this. So that's how it happened that I became interested in consciousness and all that again. I don't think it's method. I mean, we've been looking for the neural correlates, if you want to call it that, but basically the way it's thought about in neuropsychiatry is basically the neural causes of developmental disorders or psychiatric disorders for decades now. And when I started in psychiatry, which is in the 1990s, that was the decade of the brain. And the idea was, well, we have all these cool neuroimaging techniques, and that's really going to get us to the basis of what's going on here. That didn't really pan out. Then after that, the human genome was mapped, and that was published in, I think it was 2002 or 2003. And the feeling was, oh, now we have the whole human genome. And of course, psychiatric disorders all have a hereditary component. So we're going to find the genes that are causing these disorders, and then we'll understand the causal mechanisms. And we're not finding them. And the feeling in the field, not everybody, but there are certainly people who still say, well, it's just because our techniques aren't refined enough. But I don't think that's true, because we haven't, the more refined our techniques go, the better we were able to image the brain and map the brain and understand what's going on. Yes, but it's not translating better onto the psychiatric symptoms or onto the realm of human experience. That link between brain and brain activity and brain connectivity and all those neuroscientific measures, and consciousness, human experience still isn't there. It's not getting any stronger. That's very much the biology, and that restrictive elimination diet that has indeed been researched in Nijmegen. What is not always emphasized in the publications is that the dropout for that diet is huge because it's very tough to adhere to. So I think they start out with just eating pears and chicken or something like that, and then slowly build it up again to just see, what it is that the child might be reacting to. But of course, the sort of discipline it takes to actually adhere to a diet like that in a household, in a family with kids, that's a big intervention you're doing just there in terms of structure and, thinking about meals and planning them properly. So that is a huge intervention in itself. And indeed, they do claim, and I don't know, I haven't been involved in the research, that for some kids it works. And it is a very biological approach. And but when you get, and for the same for the medication, that works for some people, and for others it doesn't. But there's, for instance, also, methylphenidate is traded among students because it helps them concentrate when they're studying. So the effect of methylphenidate isn't limited to people with ADHD, works for other people too. And the argument of reductionist materialists is that, if you're taking a substance, it impacts on the brain biologically, mechanistically, therefore it must be a biological mechanism. But if you think about the placebo effect is huge. Pills without an active component work for a very varied and different numbers of sorts of disorders. For instance, in autoimmune disorders, there's been a lot of research showing that they're very effective. In ADHD, there's just one study that I'm aware of where they in fact used a placebo medication to try and taper off methylphenidate. So, they had increasing doses of placebo. Of course, it's not actually increasing the dose of anything because there's nothing active in the placebo. But that's allowed them to decrease the levels of methylphenidate people needed to have an effect. And the interesting thing about it is that even when people know that the pill they're getting is a placebo, it has a huge impact. So it's showing, at the very least, that mind also has a big impact. And, if it were a purely idealist world, which I don't know if it is, but if it is, then you would expect medicines to have an effect also, just purely because of the expectation of the mind that they are going to have an impact. I came to the conclusion that going purely down the materialist reductionist path was not going to bring us answers in psychiatry. It's more complicated than that. We're not taking we're not taking mind into consideration. We're not taking human experience into consideration, and all that plays a much bigger role than we're giving it credit for. And that's not going to bring us final answers in psychiatry, or I suspect in science in general. So where I am now is thinking about the impact of mind. So the projects I'm still doing in psychiatry at the moment. We have what we call the labeling project in Utrecht, and what we're studying there is basically, we focused on ADHD because it became much too complex to try and look at multiple disorders at once. But what is the effect of actually giving an ADHD diagnosis or an ADHD label to a child who's still developing their identity? That has positive effects, and people do it for very good reasons. They're trying to help, get a diagnosis so they can start treatment and things. But you're also impacting that child's identity and potentially their development. So we have a big multidisciplinary project where we're trying to investigate that together with, it's medical doctors, but also psychologists, philosophers, linguists, working together to try and get a handle on this. So that's one of the things I've been doing. And the other thing has been, I've always been interested in, sort of the bigger questions, the what is consciousness, and what is life about, and why are we here sorts of questions ever since childhood. And this has got me thinking about the metaphysics, because basically what we do in science is we make a metaphysical assumption that reality is materialist, and that the way to get at how reality fits together and is built up is reductionism. That's the method that's going to teach us most. And I think, that is something that is changing with the advent of complexity sciences and things. People are beginning to realize that pure reductionism, taking everything apart to see how it fits together and then how it functions, is not going to bring us all the answers that we need. But also the assumption of materialism, that is, a big assumption that we've made, and it's been very successful. It's taught us a lot, and I think we've been very good at understanding how the physical world fits together using that assumption. But it does break down much more when you get to biological, let alone sort of human sciences. And it may not be the whole story, or it may even simply be wrong, So that's got me thinking about, well, the polar opposite to materialism is idealism, which is, of course, a very new way to think about it. But just the thought experiment, okay, so what if reality is in fact mind, as Bernardo, for example, thinks, then what would the world look like and how would it work? And if you start thinking about it, it actually turns out that a lot of what we see in reality fits very well with an idealist metaphysics. We've made a box. The framework in the box is materialist reductionism, where materialism is the metaphysical assumption and reductionism is the method. I think if we want to make progress in science so that we actually get to the point where we can explain things like consciousness and, well, all those things that at the moment we're not making much headway on, we need to be willing to consider different metaphysical frameworks, but also to consider expanding the methods, the toolbox. And indeed, if we hang on to it, it has to be objective, and we need to take a third person viewpoint, then we're not going to advance beyond that. But what we can try to do is try to incorporate first person perspectives and match those to third person perspectives to try to get some sort of handle on how does it work. And I don't have very clear ideas yet about what these methods should look like exactly. I mean, one of the things we've been doing with the foundation, the Sentience and Science Foundation, for example, is just to play around with this a little bit. I mean, for example, meditation you just mentioned, that's a good example. I meditate and have had experiences meditating in groups where there's sort of a shared group experience. So there's a group of people meditating together, and they have very similar meditation experiences. Of course, you don't necessarily know that at the time, but when you talk to each other afterwards, you find out. So one of the things we've been playing around is can we meditate together, me and the other chairperson, my friend Leonika Terpstra in the Sentience and Science Foundation. We do that sometimes anyway, and then we stick an EEG net on each of our heads, and do we see our brain activity synchronize when we're meditating compared to when we're not meditating? And it turns out sitting with your eyes shut and not meditating when you're used to meditating is actually quite hard. So we sort of devised tricks, when we start to agree, I'll think about the shopping I need to get later. You think about picking your kids up from school. So we're not thinking about the same thing. Try not to meditate, do not meditate. And then after 5 minutes of that, we'll do 5 minutes of meditation and, on, off, basically scientific design. See if anything happens. That's not a study yet, but that's the beginnings of a study. And the first impression from that data is indeed there's synchronization that starts to happen between our patterns of brain activity in meditation that we don't see when we're not meditating. But sort of at the moment, that's what I want to do, sort of play around with these methods, the standard scientific methods that we're used to, that I've worked with for a long time. A lot of that is MRI, so that's a bit more complicated because those are quite big and expensive machines, and I don't have one in my back garden. But EEG is much more accessible, and see, can we sort of use these methods to get a handle on some of these phenomena that we experience, and how do they map onto each other? And that's simple mapping. It doesn't tell me what's causing what. Is it the synchronizing brain activity that's causing us to meditate? My feeling is no, it's more likely to be the other way around. We're meditating together, so that's what's causing the synchronization. But just trying to get a sense of how can we use scientific manipulation, which is something that as a psychologist I've used a lot, on-off conditions, to get at some of these experiences. Well, I'd say, that's what we've been saying since the advent of neuroscience. Once our tools get better, once our methods get better, then we will get there. And, I may be wrong, but I think that we're still making this huge assumption of materialism and saying we just have to keep going with these reductionist methods, and our computing is getting, more powerful by the day. So soon we'll have all the computing power and all the tools we need to be able to reconstruct that. Well, there's people who believe that. I simply don't, because there's an awful lot of stuff that goes on in human experience that we're not going to be able to explain that way from a theoretical perspective. And therefore, at the moment, is sort of ignored, things like, again, my friend Leonika, it happens quite frequently that I call her and she's, has her phone in her hand to call me, that sort of thing. Under a pure materialist framework, that's a coincidence at best. But if that happens, 2 out of 3 times that we're going to phone each other, it's beginning to be quite a big coincidence. So I think as scientists, it's important that we have the open-mindedness to consider that other metaphysical frameworks may have some validity. And of course, if you start thinking about idealism or even panpsychist or partially psychist frameworks, there's room for that sort of thing that there isn't in a materialist framework. And to say, well, it's just a coincidence and let's ignore it because it's not scientific is in fact rather narrow-minded, as opposed to doing what scientists should do, which is be open-minded about what they're, you don't let the theory drive the data. I think in fact practice we do that a lot, but so it's not really a scientific approach to have a theory and to try and fit all the data into it even if it doesn't really fit. At some point you have to say, well, maybe the theory is actually not the best theory to fit the data. Well, the biggest aha was perhaps quite early on in the process when I realized that it wasn't just me. To be fair, I'm not sure I believe in this materialist psychiatry anymore. It's more complicated than that. And it took me a long time to actually say that out loud to anybody. And when I did start saying it out loud at first, it was, of course, to people I trusted and who were close, like friends and things. And and there I sort of expected them to say, no, well, I actually agree with you, which they did. But to actually have conversations, and Ton was one of the first people that I spoke to that I didn't actually know very well yet. And Ton is a psychotherapist who also works in psychiatry, so he knows about the same field I do. And to realize, oh, here's somebody else who is actually struggling with these same questions. So we started meeting and having conversations, and of course we were both reading out of interest books related to what we were talking about, which is how the project started, because we started exchanging book titles and names and said, wouldn't it be interesting to go and talk to these people? So we said, well, let's just phone them or email them and say, can we come talk to you? Which we did, and some of them said yes. And then we thought, well, let's at least record these conversations, because you never know. At some point, we might be interesting to do something with them. And the second aha, perhaps, was to discover that really the sort of things that I was struggling with and Tom was struggling with, both within the context of psychiatry and biological psychiatry, other scientists in very different areas, from physics to political sciences, were struggling with very similar issues. And actually the things that people were saying, that we were saying really needed to change in our understanding of psychiatry, other people were saying the same things about their respective fields. And I was on sabbatical at that point at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study when we had the 6 of these conversations with a physicist in Amsterdam. And that's the point when I thought, well, if all these people from varying fields that are very different are saying the same thing about what the problems are in their area and what needs to change to improve it, then we really do need to do something with these conversations and put them into a book, because, here's a big problem that is an issue in at least these scientific fields, so probably broader than that in most, if not all, scientific fields. So then let's try and be part of the solution, as opposed to just keep on saying that it's a problem, and see if we can, make some sense of this and put it into a book and at least get some handle on what the problem is. Anecdotally, I agree with you totally. I mean, my impression in my own life and seeing people around me has been that the people who ignore this and try to, leave it out of the equation have come to the conclusion, that's my assumption, that they have come to the conclusion at some point that they're not going to be able to answer these questions, so they get on better in life if they just ignore them and focus on other things. Maybe I'm generalizing too much now. So I mean, for me, this has always been one of the huge questions. And again, it's one of these things where I was never, as a child also, I was never quite sure if it was just me or whether everybody thinks about these things. And of course, I've met lots of people in my life, and especially since this new direction, who are also interested in them. But then I'm still not quite sure, does this generalize to everybody? But my sense is that it does. And I don't know why that is, but my feeling is, that we, it's of course it's about us. Who are we, and what? And for each individual, who am I, and what am I doing here? How did I end up here? I can really remember as a child being quite sort of surprised about, what is all this? What's going on? As a small child, before I could articulate any of that, and that sort of sense of wonder of, not only what is going on, but why am I here and what am I supposed to do? How do I fit into this? And then, of course, as you grow up, you go through school and there are certain expectations, and you sort of end up fitting into somewhat fitting into a mold, and there are certain expectations about how we function, how we contribute to society, and go out and get a job and enough money to look after yourself and your family, and don't depend on these all sorts of norms that I grew up with anyway. And I guess as that happens, it can be tempting to sort of not worry about the other stuff. Well, what is all this? How did I get here? What is it exactly that I'm supposed to be doing, as a sort of a life intention, if you want to call it that? That sort of question that I felt. I've been thinking about this again more recently since I've started working in this field again. And I remember feeling that as a young child. Well, what is it I'm supposed to do? And then the answer ends up coming from parents and school and sort of the society you're in. But it's not really it's not a fulfilling answer, in the sense that what you end up doing is fitting into this mold of expectations. But it doesn't really answer the question, well, why am I here and what is it I'm supposed to be? I mean, I want to say contribute to what's going on. And I guess that's a very fundamental life question, if not for everybody, then at least for many people. And as you just said, I mean, my impression is too that people who put that to one side and try not to think about it, often it comes back to hit them at some stage, midlife or end of life sometimes, when we all face mortality at some point. That also seems to be a point when people start asking these questions. What did I do with my life? Was that what I wanted to do, should have done, etc.? the definition I like best is the sense of something it is like. It is like something to be. It is like something to be me. It is like something to be a bat. It is like something to experience the color red. The fact that there is a qualitative aspect to experience, that's my probably favorite definition of consciousness. Yeah, well, what I'm doing or trying to do is to actually start with consciousness. So with experience, and so, for example, what I just said about the EEG nets and meditating together. So we're starting with the experience of meditation, using a little bit of a psychological method here, where we have on and off conditions and compare the two, so that we can see what's changing biologically. But the outset is in fact the psychological experience, the meditation experience. And of course, we can compare notes. We don't talk while we're meditating, but we do compare notes afterwards. Well, what did you experience? What did I experience? Were there similarities? And of course, if you both experience light or something, you don't know that happened at the exact same moment in meditation. So that's sort of challenges to think about. There's I got involved recently, I guess a year ago. I did a course on a meditation technique called insight dialogue, where insight as in INSIGHT, so insight. And basically what that is a form of meditation where you meditate, and so far I've only done it ever with one other person, and you have a conversation about your experience. So you can converse during meditation. And it's interesting because, of course, you get other input into your meditation that you wouldn't normally, but it's the experience is also very interesting because you you actually become very connected to this person in your experience. And I did an introductory course online because COVID, Corona, so all this sort of stuff has moved online too. And the course was run from the east coast of the US, I forget exactly where. And I was doing this course with 20 other people who were all over the globe in my study, on my computer screen, the same way I'm having a conversation with you now. And, we'd do these exercises, and I'd be put into a pair in Zoom with some random person from the group. I didn't know any of these people. There were no coffee breaks, so I didn't get to chat at them, while we were waiting for the course to start or any of this. And suddenly you'd be meditating together and doing whatever the exact request was. And I'd feel deeply, deeply, deeply connected. And the people I meditated with during the course, at the end of the course, I must have meditated with, I don't know, 5 or 6, maybe more different people. And I really felt connected to those people, even in the sessions afterwards. And when the course ended, I thought, oh, I'm never going to see that person again. So there's ways of starting with the experience and then, seeing if you can sort of tack on what might be more third party observations. And of course, no observation is ever really third party. That's just what we like to think. And get a handle on it that way. So I'm trying to work on both ends of the spectrum, think about how I can use standard scientific methodological approaches and combine them with, which are to me 2 new ways of playing with the consciousness experience. And I like meditation because that's what I'm familiar with, and that I have a handle on. Other consciousness research is one thing that's a big thing in consciousness research, is manipulating consciousness through the use of psychotropic drugs. To me, that seems a bit like, shooting a cannon at a mosquito, as they would say in Dutch. So I think consciousness is probably more subtle. You don't need to induce hallucinations to get a handle on it. But that's another way of thinking about these things. Yeah. One of the things that came up repeatedly during this course, which of course was not a scientific course, it was an introduction to this method of meditation course. And at the end of each session, we'd have sort of 10 minutes when people could share their experience and talk about. And every single time, I think the entire course was something like 8 meetings. And every single time there was somebody who said, I just wanted to say I had a wonderful meditation with so-and-so, and we felt so incredibly connected. So this is one of the things, and humans, we're all familiar with having the experience of feeling connected to another person. We have loved ones and people we feel close to. And there's all sorts of theories about that, about how it's evolutionarily adaptive, etc., which may all be true, and probably is true on some level of understanding. As you say, I mean, the only way you really have of comparing whether there's any more to it is the both the sides of the experience. And one way you can do that, of course, is to interview both people separately afterwards and get independent accounts of the experience they had. And even then, two ends of a connection may feel different. There's no reason it should be an identical experience. But the fact that we experience that gets back to, our primary, the primary thing we know about the world, the only thing we know about the world is our experience of it. And connection is very, very true to us humans, whether or not we can explain it materialistically. Therefore, we need to work from the assumption that it's real and find ways in the metaphysical framework that it fits into. And with, fancy theorizing, you can fit it into materialism in a sense and say, it's evolutionarily adaptive, and parents need to feel connected to their children so that they will protect them, and children need to feel connected to their parents so that they will stick close to them and be nourished and all that. But my problem with the materialist framework is that it doesn't really cover the aspect of experience. It gives functional explanations for the experience we had, but it doesn't actually explain that it is something it is like. Being connected feels like something, and that aspect of feeling like something is not explained. Given all that I've said, you won't be surprised to learn that I'm not on the brain generates consciousness out of materials, basically. The brain is organic material that somehow generates consciousness. And the extreme neuroscience stance on that is, and there's actually no function to it. It's just sort of an artifact of the brain keeping the organism alive. One side note to say is that I think the whole brain consciousness theory is actually also a bit too narrow. One of the things that's big in even in materialist versions of consciousness theory right now is embodiment. So, the experience of being a human being is not just about what your brain does, but it's also about the whole fact that you have a body that you feel is you or belongs to you, or and that you can manipulate, and that interacts with the environment. The filter theory, of course, speaks more to a sort of a panpsychist way of thinking about it. And it's certainly the case that it accounts for a lot more of our experiences, and potentially for the fact that we feel like an individual. The way I like thinking about it is more of in a sense, a complex system sort of way. So we tend to think of ourselves as an individual, a self that interacts with an external environment. And what that does, thinking about it that way, is it places a very hard and fast boundary between, the self and the environment. And I think that may be a bit simplistic. In the sense that we're not really that separate from our environments, of course. Even in a physical sense, we're losing skin cells all the time and hair. We take in food and ingest things from our environment that we then digest to create energy so that we can keep on living. We're breathing the whole time and interacting with our environments that way. We interact with each other. We have experience of doing that. That gives a sense of connectedness and things we just talked about. So I think one thing we may be missing in thinking about consciousness is we think of it as this very individual thing that belongs to an individual. However, when you meditate and things, for example, you can really have a sense of expanding consciousness where you've suddenly where you can feel, and this doesn't happen every time, it doesn't happen to everybody necessarily, but you can feel conscious of the oneness of everything, the way everything is connected. And, I like to think that maybe indeed consciousness is something that extends beyond the individual. If you're thinking from an idealist perspective, then the question comes really, why does it even bottle down into a single individual? And do we feel like an individual most of the time? And one thing that implies is that we can sort of extend our consciousness and be aware of more than just that individual sense of self. And I think that may be in part a cultural thing too, where we've become, because in part of our materialist, reductionist way of understanding the world, then it becomes, the implication is that, consciousness is something that must arise from matter. And then we have these lumps of matter that we call human beings, and they have this conscious experience, and other lumps of matter, such as dogs, may also have it. We're not sure, but I'm inclined to think they probably do. Albeit in a little bit of a different way than we do. And then if that's coming out of the matter, then that must be, something that only applies to the individual. And then any sort of connection you feel has to be within that individual projected onto the other. And of course, by thinking in the reverse sense, then the question is, why do we ever feel like individual clumps of matter, or mind for that matter? So I like the fields of theory. I'm not sure that's going to prove to be the full answer either. And of course, it does not solve the problem from the binding problem. Why does a particular bit of consciousness attach itself to a particular bit of matter, and seem to stay stuck that way for human lifetime, as far as we can tell? Yeah. No, and I think what would serve, one of the things I've been thinking about, and I would like to do, but it would be a vast exercise, and I certainly couldn't do it by myself. But it's to, I think what would be the scientific way to approach it, was we have, of course, a mound of scientific data from a huge number of fields about the world. We have always approached that and analyzed that and thought about that in the framework of materialism. What would be an interesting exercise is to define a number of metaphysical frameworks, where I think materialism needs to be one, and idealism needs to be one, and then it'd be nice to have one or two, I don't know exactly, I haven't worked it out in detail, in between. And you just take some of these examples of data of things we think we understand in the materialist framework and ask, what would this actually look like in these other frameworks? And that doesn't tell us which framework is right, but I think, sort of the preliminary exercises I've done thinking about this myself suggest that materialism is not the only framework that's going to explain all or even any of it. Some things like love fit much better in other frameworks, like idealism, like panpsychism. And indeed, as you say, matter could fall out of idealism. There's not really any reason that thinking that everything is mind is any stranger than thinking that everything is matter. They're both as extreme when you think about it. They're just opposite. And we're very used to the one and not so used to the other. You were just asking me about the aha moments for that book, and that was one of them, certainly, when I had always sort of thought, I'm a psychologist and I don't feel very qualified talking about quantum physics or anything difficult like that. And I'd always thought, well, this is really weird, and I'm not understanding it properly, but to me this seems like there must be some sort of implication. And then talking to actual physicists who work on this stuff and understand it properly, and hear them saying, well, quantum physics is in fact telling us that the way we understand the world now, at least at these very small scales, and of course they qualify and all that, isn't isn't right. This is not, cannot be the explanation. And, they sort of, one of the expressions one of them said was, well, and when the students always ask, of course, so students, university students coming in to study physics, learn about quantum physics properly for the first time. And they say, well, yes, but how can this possibly be the same, the case? And the answer they give them is, well, don't think about it, just shut up and do the math, essentially. So you don't ask these big metaphysical questions. And I think that's something that is changing. More and more people, including in physics, and physics is probably one of the fields that's leading the way, because, we think of it as one of the core, if not the core science. Everything should be reducible back down to physics. And if physics is telling us this can't be the correct framework, or not the whole framework, not the whole story, and then, something is clearly going on. You need a certain level of organization, probably, for certain functions in consciousness to emerge. I think the something it is likeness probably extends back into evolution to really simple life forms, although I've only been around for a certain amount of time. How would I know what it was like 100 million years ago? But I tend to think about, I have the inclination to think, the intuition, that probably consciousness is somehow tied to life, to have something it is likeness to be an organism. And if we're talking about individual consciousness, not some big collective field. And if that really is tied to life, then that probably extends down to even unicellular organisms. I mean, an amoeba can propel itself in the direction of a bacterium that it wants to eat and ingest it. I suspect, though have no way of proving this, that there's something it is like for that amoeba to do that. They will also shy away from toxic substances. I also suspect there's something that it's like. I suspect that my cat or my dog, for instance, have a much higher level of consciousness than that. They have the cat and the dog are different, clearly, for many reasons, but also I suspect in some way they're a bit different in what their consciousness looks like. They both have understanding of that they are in an environment and that they have humans that they interact with, and that's us. I suspect the cat has a slightly higher developed sense of self than the dog. I'm not entirely sure. That could be a reflection of my individual cat and dog. It doesn't necessarily apply to them all. But I think, for instance, that the reflecting upon who am I and what am I here to do sort of level of consciousness and ability is probably something that you need a greater deal of organization to. So the sort of meta consciousness. Yeah, I think there needs to be a certain level of organization to support that sort of complexity. In a certain way, it's actually quite materialist to think that it needs a complexity of the brain. Maybe it could be any sort of complexity. It might be a complexity, if you're going from an idealist perspective, it might be a complexity of mind that then translates as something that looks like a complex material organization, such as a brain or a human body. So I wouldn't be sure what the direction of that is, but I do think that what individual consciousness, in the sense of what it is likeness looks like, probably depends on the complexity of the mind of the organism or the organism, whichever comes first, or the interplay between those two. The short answer is, of course, I don't know, because I'm a scientist. I'm trying to find data, and questions like that really go to the purpose of life. And as a scientist, I have absolutely no idea, because that's not what science studies, for one thing. What is the purpose of life? I mean, I think current science assumes there isn't one. That's just a nice human idea and something we would like to believe, because, it gives some answers to questions like, why am I here and what is it I'm exactly supposed to be doing? From a personal point of view, I'd like to think that there is some point to life and something, that I'm, I don't know, here to do not in the sense of being on a mission or anything. And of course, in sort of more spiritual circles, there's this idea that life might be about learning lessons, and you come here with some sort of life lesson to learn, or something that is related to what it is you're contributing. I quite like that idea. I'm not sure if it's true. I don't think there's any way to get at it scientifically, at least not at the moment. Where's evolution leading? No idea. I think if you think about evolution and the way life has evolved on the planet, as far as I can, as much as I know about that, it's probably, it's increased greatly in complexity, which suggests that the possibility for life lessons and contribution has probably also changed and evolved in that period. So did dinosaurs come to Earth with a life lesson and something they were to learn? I don't know. I have a very poor understanding of what dinosaur consciousness might have looked like. Hard to imagine. It's, I have no direct experience of dinosaurs, only in museums and things. It's very hard to know. I'd like to think there was some sort of reason to it, but scientifically, the only thing I can say about that is don't know. Big question mark. Maybe, like to think so, don't know. Yeah. And hopefully, if I think one of the things that I'd like, and one of the reasons I'm doing what I'm doing, is that it would be good to let these sort of questions exist within the scientific framework. And maybe I think we've ruled out an awful lot of things that we're not going to talk about or think about because they're not scientific. I think that's a mistake, because if we're going to, have a full understanding of reality and who we are in it, then I think we need to allow those questions back in. And it may be that for some questions, we have to conclude this is not something we're ever going to be able to address within science. And that, if that's the case, then that can be the case. But to sort of lock that door ahead of time and say, let's not just think about that. That has to be nonsense. We're shutting the door to a whole realm of human experience. Consciousness has come back into science. When I first started psychology, the consciousness wasn't something we talked about within psychology. That was not the realm of psychology. If you wanted to think about consciousness, you needed to go do philosophy or something like that. So I think that's something that we've now allowed back in, and as you say, I think a lot of that is actually a sort of an inheritance from splitting these two worlds, human experience, including the divine and any sort of spiritual experiences, from the scientific world. But now science has expanded to the point that we're trying to understand the whole of reality from science, and anything that goes to spirituality and things we're sort of dismissing. And we're trying to even include consciousness and human experience, the bits that we consider to be real, at least from a scientific perspective. But because of that, we're shutting out a whole domain, and we're perhaps overextending the scientific paradigm to try and include all that. But if we want to understand the whole of reality, we're either going to have to widen our scientific domain of what we are prepared to think about and look at, but also then the methods that we apply and the metaphysical frameworks we're willing to consider. Well, first of all, I agree. There's great progress being made, and one of the things since I've started down on this path, really, that keeps surprising me is how much development there actually is. I mean, I just got back from holiday yesterday and and one of the things in my email was an invitation to a scientific workshop organized by a leading scientist about the role of intuition in complex systems, which, I'm just like, wow, this is actually happening. And this is, within the sort of hardcore scientific field. So there is certainly huge progress being made. I think there's a number of fields or avenues that are potentially promising. I like complex systems research, and that's not really a field, I guess, but more of an approach and a way of thinking about how reality fits together in that's being applied in various fields, including in human sciences. A lot of what's being done there is still sort of not perhaps reductionist, but certainly materialist, in that what happens a lot of the time is computer modeling of complex systems to try and predict how they're going to behave. So we're not actually looking at the individual parts in a reductionist way to see how the whole system is going to behave, but we're looking at trying to model the whole system to see how it's going to behave. That's still rather materialist, but I do think it brings up interesting questions that are relevant, like the boundaries of the system, because if you're going to model a system, you need to define what is in fact the system, which, one was just talking about how humans aren't actually separate from the environment, but are in constant interaction. Well, that sort of thing comes into play there. There's been a lot of work, and there's increasing amounts of work on things like the placebo effect. I think that's very promising, because it sort of gets us thinking about how is our mind actually affecting our physiological system. I think that's an interesting avenue. And I like these approaches where we're actually sort of coming at it from the other angle. So thinking about it from a consciousness perspective. So meditation research, for example, is one. And I already mentioned the psychotropic substances. That's one I like. Last month was the annual meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. That was in Amsterdam last month, and one of the things that they had there was a debate between proponents of various consciousness theories. I like that, because I think what is happening there is interesting, because they are actually pitting these different theories against each other. Most of them are still very much materialist in the basis. But I said this before, but that field does have philosophers of mind and things involved in it in a way that many neuroscience fields don't really yet. So I think there's great promise in that sort of comparison approach, looking at these different theories. And in fact, one of the leading theories in consciousness research is integrated information theories, and that is not actually is agnostic in terms of its metaphysical stance. It's often interpreted as being materialist, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. It's just a question of information processing, and whether that's materialist processing or a different platform doesn't really matter to the theory. So there's a few, and one thing that I find very encouraging is that everywhere I look, there seem to be people standing up and saying, well, actually, we might need to think about this differently, including in my own field. Yeah. Well, to some degree, I think it's an open question. I think what is happening at the moment is that we're coming to the conclusion that the framework and the methods we have at the moment are too limited and are not going to supply all the answers on what is reality and fit it into an overarching framework. So what we really need most is open-mindedness, and the willingness to note that there are problems with the current approaches and the current framework, and that we need to look at other possible approaches and combine them. And that's, any methods development is also a question of simply trial and error. We think this should work, let's try it. Or actually it doesn't, let's tweak it. Anybody who's done any computer programming or anything like that, well, no, it's a lot of tweaking and not necessarily huge, big, great ideas at the outset. So the willingness to play with methods and tweak, and try to combine first-person methods with third-person ones, I think is important, and it's something that we need to play around with and get a handle on. But also the willingness to look at the framework, and then what is it that it's actually going to take to get science to change in that direction. I'm inclined to think a combination of both, and tipping point. Enough scientists realizing that, this is necessary. We're not going to get there just by hanging on to the old theories and the old methods and the old framework. And, the classic answer to that is, what do we need? Well, at some point, there'll be a new generation of scientists who have grown up thinking about, hey, there may be other methods of physics out there that actually work better, and are prepared to consider that as a serious alternative. So it may simply be a question of time from that point of view. I'd probably tell them, to follow their heart and their intuition in what they want to do. One of the things that I did with another colleague in Utrecht is we did a pilot of a course, which we called Science 42.0, in reference to Douglas Adams and the answer to the life, the universe, and everything. And basically what it was a philosophy of science course, but we didn't do lots of heavy reading and things. We sort of asked these questions. So what are the things that you're running into your own field? What is reductionism? What is emergence? What are the limits of the understanding your field can bring you? What are you actually encountering in your own research? And just to get people thinking about that. That was, it was really fun for us. It was really fun for them, or so they said. So this was sort of senior PhD students and postdocs who are actually doing hands-on research and are getting to the point in their own research that they're realizing the sort of limits to, I thought I was going to answer all these bunch of questions, and now I'm getting results. And it turns out that these results are not actually answering the questions the way I thought they might, but there's sort of a limit there, and I'm not getting the data I expected. I thought it would look like this, and it doesn't. It looks completely different, and I don't understand. And nobody thinks, oh, the theory is wrong. Everybody thinks I did something wrong. My data is broken. Something's gone terribly wrong here. Just to get them thinking about these ideas, and I think that's something I'd advise all young starting out scientists to do, is think about some of these philosophical issues. And also, I think that's one thing that's very important in university courses. It used to be the case that nearly all university courses had some form of philosophy of science somewhere in the course. There was none in my psychology course, and I think for many courses these days that's no longer the case. And I think it would be very good to bring that back, and to take that step back and have young scientists going into science realize, hey, there's actually a metaphysical assumption here at the outset.